The crack of a rifle shatters the dawn silence across the Colorado foothills. A single bullet strikes the earth with surgical precision, a warning, not a kill. In the aftermath of war, justice wears many faces. Some men find it in a judge's gavel, others at the end of a gun. But the most dangerous justice comes from those who understand both worlds, who've witnessed humanity at its darkest and returned with unflinching purpose. 3 years is a long time to wait for vengeance. 3 years to transform grief into calculation, to convert a humble frontier cabin into an impregnable fortress, to gather evidence while powerful men sleep soundly, believing their sins safely buried. They say the West forgives many things, greed, violence, even murder, but they never considered what happens when the widow they dismissed was forged in the shadow war that saved a nation, when she carries the patience of a sniper and the precision of an executioner. Today, as armed men surround her home, they'll learn their gravest mistake wasn't the murder they ordered. It was underestimating who survived to seek justice. The mountain wind whispered through the pines as Victoria Harlow swept her cabin's porch with practiced efficiency. Her movements were economical, betraying none of the vigilance that kept her alive these past 3 years. At 48, she wore her solitude like armor. To the folks in Silver Pine, she was just another war widow who'd moved west to start fresh. They admired her self-sufficiency but kept their distance, just how she wanted it. Victoria paused, the broom still in her weathered hands. Something wasn't right. Her gaze drifted to the tree line where dawn painted the pines gold. There it was again, movement where there shouldn't be. She hung the broom on its peg and stepped inside, shutting the door with deliberate calm. The simple two-room cabin appeared unremarkable. A cooking area, small dining table, modest bedroom. Nothing to suggest its owner had transformed it into an impenetrable fortress. Victoria moved to the fireplace and pulled a small mirror from her apron pocket. With practiced precision, she positioned it through a nearly invisible slit in the stones, angling it to connect with a series of hidden observation points throughout the cabin. Through this ingenious network, she confirmed what her instincts had already told her. 5 men armed strategically, positioning themselves around her property. Finally, she whispered, a grim smile touching her lips. Victoria knelt beside her bed and slid out a wooden chest. The lock clicked open under her touch, revealing her past and her purpose. The Winchester rifle came first, followed by a Colt Army revolver that had belonged to Thomas. She checked each weapon with practiced hands, muscle memory from another life taking over. Hidden beneath the floorboards, a second chest held her most valuable weapon. Documentation, land deeds, witness testimonies, and a damning letter bearing the signature of Maxwell Thornton, the railroad baron who'd built his empire on theft, corruption, and murder, including the murder of her husband Thomas. Victoria glanced at his photograph on the nightstand. The only personal item visible in the cabin, Thomas Harlow, federal land investigator. His kind eyes and resolute expression, forever frozen in time. "They're here," she told the photograph. "Just like you said, they'd come." She tucked 2 folded letters into her boot, insurance should things go wrong, and moved to her primary observation position by the north window. Through her mirror system, she watched the men finishing their preparations. Their leader stood apart from the others, tall, broad-shouldered, with the unmistakable bearing of a military man. His movements displayed tactical precision as he directed his men with hand signals. Victoria recognized from her own training. This was no ordinary band of outlaws. These were experienced fighters using military formations. Victoria checked the specialized firing positions she'd built into each window frame. 3 years of preparation had transformed this simple cabin into an elaborate defensive position with reinforced walls, protected shooting angles, and carefully calculated sightlines. As first light broke over the mountains, Victoria counted 5 horses tethered in the distant tree line. 5 men against 1 woman. They clearly expected an easy victory. She allowed herself a small, cold smile. They had no idea who they were hunting. Nathan Sullivan adjusted his hat against the rising sun and studied the cabin through his field glasses. Single horse in the stable, smoke from the chimney, a woman's dress hanging on the clothesline. Everything matched Thornton's description, a widow living alone on valuable land. "Simple job," muttered Carter beside him, checking his Remington. "Get her to sign over the property or clear her out." "Why'd you need 5 of us?" Sullivan lowered his glasses, his expression unreadable. We do this clean, professional. Clean, don't put gold in my pocket. Carter spat. This is the third farm this month. Thornton's paying for results. And he'll get them. Sullivan replied, his voice carrying the edge of command that had once directed men across battlefields. But we do it my way. Davies circle north. Torres take the stable approach. Hayes with me, Carter hold position until my signal. The men moved with practiced coordination, though Carter's scowl showed his reluctance to follow orders. Young Hayes, barely 22, kept close to Sullivan as they approached the cabin's western side. Captain Hayes whispered, using Sullivan's former military rank. Something feels off. Look at how she's positioned everything. Clear sight lines in all directions. Sullivan nodded slightly. The kid had good instincts. There was indeed something methodical about the cabin's placement and the surrounding clearing that tickled his tactical awareness. Stay alert, he advised. But remember, she's just a widow. They reached the edge of the clearing. Sullivan raised his hand, signaling his men to hold positions. Across the open ground, he could see Davies and Torres in place awaiting his command. 3 sharp knocks on the front door would begin their standard approach. Sullivan nodded to Hayes, who stepped forward, his expression schooled into friendly openness. Mrs. Harlow? Hayes called out, his voice pitched to sound unthreatening. Got some trouble with my horse. Wondering if I might trouble you for some water. Silence answered him. Hayes glanced back at Sullivan, who gestured for him to continue. Ma'am, I can see smoke from your chimney. Just need a moment of your time. When no response came, Sullivan stepped forward. Mrs. Victoria Harlow, he called, dropping all pretense of politeness. We know you're alone in there. This can go easy or hard, but either way, we'll be coming inside to discuss the future of this property. The silence stretched until Carter hissed impatiently from his position. Kick it in Hayes' old woman's, probably hiding under her bed. Wait, Sullivan ordered, sensing something wasn't right. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, the same feeling he'd had before ambushes during the war. Mrs. Harlow, he tried once more. You have 1 minute to open this door before we open it for you. I'd hate to damage such a fine piece of craftsmanship. Mr. Sullivan, I presume. The voice, calm, measured female, carried easily through the door. Sullivan froze. She knew his name. I've been expecting you since your scout examined my property yesterday afternoon. Sullivan exchanged a startled glance with Hayes. No scout had been sent ahead. You have me at a disadvantage, ma'am. Sullivan replied cautiously. Don't believe we've been properly introduced. No formal introduction needed when you've been tracking a man's movements for weeks. The voice responded. 5 attacks on homesteads across 2 territories. Always isolated properties. Always at dawn. Always with the same patterns. Sullivan signaled his men to spread wider, unnerved by the woman's knowledge. Her voice continued steady and confident. You and your men are trespassing on private property. Mr. Sullivan, I'll give you the courtesy you didn't extend to the Hanson family or the Wilkinsons. Leave now, and we'll have no quarrel. Sullivan's face hardened. Impressive research for a widow living alone in the wilderness. He called back. But knowing who we are won't change what's happening here. This land is worth a great deal to certain interests in Denver. You can leave with your personal belongings and a fair payment, or you can leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. Those are your only options. There's always another option. Mr. Sullivan, and what might that be? He asked, a hint of mockery entering his voice. You could discover that you've made a grave tactical error in your assessment of this situation. Sullivan laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. 5 armed men against 1 woman. I'd say our assessment is sound. Numbers mean little when positions are compromised, she replied calmly. Your man by the stable is standing on unstable ground. The one by my garden has poor cover and worse sight lines. The 2 approaching from the south have placed themselves in a potential crossfire. And you, Mr. Sullivan, are silhouetted perfectly against the eastern sky. Sunam. Sullivan felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. He scanned the cabin with new attention, noting details he'd previously overlooked. The unusual angle of the window frames, the reinforced shutters, the absence of standard vulnerabilities. "You talk like a military man, Mrs. Harlow." He said, his voice quieter but carrying clearly in the still morning. "Observant," she replied, but incomplete. "Now I'll ask once more. Remove yourself and your men from my property." Sullivan straightened, squaring his shoulders as he made his decision. "Can't do that, ma'am, too much at stake." He signaled to Hayes with a sharp gesture, "Secure the entrance." Hayes moved toward the door, raising his boot to kick it open. A shot cracked through the morning stillness, striking the door frame inches from Hayes's hand. The young man jerked backward with a startled cry as his companions dove for cover. "That was your only warning shot." The woman's voice called into the ensuing silence. Sullivan took cover behind a large oak tree, his mind racing. This was no ordinary widow. The precision of that shot, the tactical awareness in her words. He was missing something critical. "Keep her pinned down." He ordered his men, "Hayes, circle around back, Torres, cover the north window." The men began firing at the cabin, bullets thudding into the sturdy logs or whistling through windows. Inside, Victoria moved swiftly between her prepared positions, counting shots methodically. The man behind the oak, Sullivan, was using a Spencer repeating rifle. 7 rounds before reloading, Carter by the water trough carried a Winchester. Davies and Torres wielded shotguns effective at close range, but useless beyond 30 yards. From the back of the cabin came the sound of breaking glass. Hayes attempting to enter through the kitchen window. Victoria had anticipated this move, having deliberately left that window unshuttered to create an apparent vulnerability. A sudden crash followed by a pained curse confirmed her trap had worked. The weakened floorboards had given way, dropping Hayes into the shallow pit she dug beneath her kitchen floor. "Hayes is down," came a shout from outside. "Something's wrong with the floor." Victoria took advantage of the momentary distraction. In one fluid motion, she moved to the north window, using the specialized rifle rest she'd built into the frame. Through her custom sight, she located Torres, who'd been edging toward her stable. The distance was approximately 80 yards. A challenging shot for most, but well within her capabilities. She exhaled slowly, then squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked, and Torres dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder as he fell back against the structure. The shot had been precisely placed to disable without killing. "She got Torres." Carter called out, tension evident in his tone. From behind the oak, Sullivan barked new orders. "Hold positions. Davies, get Hayes out of there." Carter, circle wide to the east. Victoria moved immediately to her next position, anticipating their adjustment. Carter began firing steadily at the north window, where she'd just been allowing Davies to begin a flanking maneuver around the eastern approach to the cabin. "You're no ordinary widow, Mrs. Harlow," Sullivan called out during a lull in the firing. That shoulder shot was a military precision. Victoria remained silent, tracking Davies attempting to flank her position. He was good using the natural contours of the land for cover, moving only when Carter provided covering fire. But he hadn't noticed the thin wire stretched between 2 pine saplings at ankle height, another of Victoria's carefully placed preparations. As Davies reached the wire, he stumbled forward with a startled cry. The noise was minimal, but to Victoria's trained ear, it provided the exact location she needed. Through a narrow gap in the shutters, she fired a round that struck the ground inches from Davies' hand, sending dirt and pine needles into his face. "Your man to the east should stay down, Mr. Sullivan," Victoria called out calmly. "His position is compromised." A tense silence followed. Victoria checked on Hayes through a small observation port she'd built into the kitchen cabinet. The young man nursed a bruised leg, looking thoroughly confused about his predicament. "What kind of woman are you?" he muttered, not realizing she could hear him. Outside, Sullivan conferred quietly with Carter, their body language revealing growing frustration. This wasn't proceeding according to their plan. "Mrs. Harlow," Sullivan called again, his voice carrying a new edge of forced reasonableness. "It seems we've underestimated you. Perhaps we can discuss terms after all." "Nothing to discuss," Victoria replied. "My terms remain the same. Leave my property immediately." She watched Sullivan shake his head, his expression hardening as he signaled to Carter in hushed tones. The men began shifting positions, creating a more distributed perimeter around the cabin. They were settling in for a longer confrontation. "Fire won't work, Mr. Sullivan," she called out as 2 men began gathering kindling. The roof has been treated with a solution of alum and clay. The walls, too. It's an old army technique for frontier outposts. Through her mirror, she caught the brief flash of surprise on Sullivan's face before he masked it. You seem to know a lot about military tactics for a homesteader, Mrs. Harlow. And you employ cavalry flanking maneuvers with surprising precision for an outlaw, Captain Sullivan. Victoria replied deliberately, using his former military rank. 12th Massachusetts Cavalry under Colonel Westfield, if I'm not mistaken. Distinguished service at Gettysburg. A profound silence followed her words. Victoria could almost feel the shock rippling through the men surrounding her cabin. How could this isolated widow know such specific details about their leader's past? Who are you? Sullivan demanded, genuine uncertainty, now evident in his voice. Victoria moved to another window, this one providing a clear view of Sullivan's position behind the oak tree. Through her specialized sight, she could see the confusion on his face, the recalculation happening behind his eyes. Someone who recognizes cavalry deployment patterns? She answered, someone who knows that your current position leaves your men vulnerable to enfilade fire from my east and north windows, simultaneously. To demonstrate her point, Victoria fired 2 shots in rapid succession. The first splintered a branch above Carter's head, sending him diving for better cover. The second struck the ground between Davies and Torres, who had been attempting to regroup. That's twice I've chosen not to hit your men directly, Victoria noted calmly. There won't be a third time. Inside the pit beneath her kitchen floor, Hayes had gone very still, listening to the exchange. With growing apprehension, Victoria heard him mutter a prayer under his breath. Outside, Sullivan studied the cabin with new eyes, noting details he'd overlooked before. The precise positioning of each window, the slightly unusual pitch of the roof, designed to eliminate blind spots, the carefully maintained clear areas that provided unobstructed firing lanes in all directions. You've turned this entire cabin into a defensive position, he said, finally, realization evident in his tone. Every window, every approach. Yes, Victoria confirmed simply. And I've had 3 years to perfect it. A new wariness entered Sullivan's expression. You still haven't answered my question, Mrs. Harlow. Who are you really? Victoria shifted position again, maintaining her tactical advantage while keeping all approaches in view. The moment had come to change the dynamic of this confrontation. During the war, the Union Army had a special division that operated behind Confederate lines. She stated, her voice carrying clearly to all the men surrounding her cabin. Small teams, specialized training, focused on high-value targets and intelligence gathering. She paused, letting her words sink in. They called us the Phantoms. Victoria's revelation about the Phantom Division hung in the morning air, transforming the atmosphere of the confrontation. Through her network of mirrors, she watched understanding dawn across Sullivan's face. The recognition of a predator, realizing he'd stumbled into the territory of a more dangerous hunter. The Phantoms were a myth. Carter called out, uncertainty evident in his voice. Stories made up to scare Confederate scouts. That's what we wanted everyone to believe. Victoria replied, her tone matter-of-fact. 12 men and 8 women operating in teams of 2 or 3. We moved through enemy territory, gathering intelligence, eliminating strategic targets, and disrupting supply lines. She shifted position again, using the specialized handholds she'd built into her cabin walls to move silently between firing ports. This constant movement was a technique she'd perfected during urban operations in Richmond, never staying in one location long enough to be targeted. 8 women? Sullivan questioned, disbelief coloring his tone, despite his growing unease. The Union Army officially didn't, Victoria interrupted. Unofficially, General Grant recognized that women could move through Southern territory with less suspicion. We posed as widows, laundresses, nurses, invisible, until we chose not to be. From his position behind the oak tree, Sullivan gestured subtly to his men. Victoria noted how they began adjusting their stances, preparing for a coordinated rush on his signal. A common cavalry tactic when facing an entrenched position. Your men should reconsider their next move carefully, Victoria warned, her voice carrying easily across the clearing. The east and south approaches are covered by tripwires connected to alarm systems. The western approach has pressure-sensitive plates beneath the soil that will alert me to any movement. To demonstrate her awareness, Victoria fired a precise shot that kicked up dirt just inches from a concealed pressure plate. One of the men had been approaching. The man froze, his expression a mixture of shock and newfound fear. Inside the pit beneath her kitchen floor, Hayes had begun examining his surroundings more carefully. "This ain't just a root cellar," he muttered, running his fingers along the precisely joined wooden supports. "This is a holding cell." "Correct, Mr. Hayes," Victoria called down through the observation port, startling him. "Designed to temporarily contain intruders without causing permanent harm? The war taught me that killing should always be a last resort." Outside, Sullivan had gone silent, reassessing the situation with the calculated precision that had once made him an effective cavalry officer. Victoria watched him studying the cabin with new eyes, mentally mapping firing angles and defensive positions. "If you're who you claim to be," he finally called out, "you have a name, a designation that others would recognize." Victoria paused, considering the implications of acknowledging her former identity. For 3 years, she'd buried that part of herself, becoming simply Victoria Harlow, widow and homesteader. Reclaiming her wartime designation meant accepting that her peaceful interlude had ended. "They called me Shadow." Victoria answered, her voice steady, "lead scout and precision shooter for the Phantom Division's Western operations, specializing in long-range eliminations and intelligence gathering behind enemy lines." The effect of her words was immediate. Davies, the man with a pronounced limp who'd been maintaining position by the water trough, actually lowered his weapon slightly. "Shadow is dead," he stated, though uncertainty had entered his voice. "Killed during operations near Atlanta in '64. That's what the official reports say, Mr. Davies," Victoria replied, deliberately using his name to unsettle him further. "The same reports that claim Captain Nathan Sullivan died at Petersburg, rather than returning home to form a criminal enterprise targeting vulnerable homesteaders." She shifted again, moving to the specialized firing port she constructed in her chimney, an unconventional position that provided coverage of the entire northern approach. Through her network of mirrors, she watched confusion spread among the men who had entered this confrontation confident in their numerical superiority. "Your reputation preceded you if you truly are Shadow." Sullivan acknowledged, his voice carrying a new note of professional respect beneath the tension. 28 confirmed eliminations, all from distances our sharpshooters considered impossible. They said you could hit a man's pocket watch at 500 yards. To 473, Victoria corrected calmly. "The stories grew with each telling, but accurate enough for your current circumstances to be concerning." From his position behind the woodpile, Torres, the man Victoria had wounded earlier, began inching backward, clearly reassessing his exposure. Victoria allowed this retreat, knowing that creating division among the outlaws would work to her advantage. "I don't care what fancy titles she had during the war," snarled Carter, the heavy-set man with a bushy beard, who'd been maintaining position behind a large boulder. "She's still just one woman against 5 men. I say we rush her from all sides. She can't cover everything at once." "She doesn't need to, Carter," Sullivan responded sharply. "She only needs to hit the first 2 or 3 men who break cover. Are you volunteering to lead that charge?" Carter fell silent, his bravado diminishing under his leader's pointed question. Inside the pit beneath the kitchen, Hayes had begun examining the construction more carefully. "This wood ain't from around here," he observed aloud. "It's southern pine, not the local timber." "Perceptive," Victoria noted through the observation port. "The supports are from a Confederate supply wagon we captured near Chattanooga. I found that items taken during war make for excellent building materials in peacetime." A kind of poetic justice. Outside, Sullivan had begun a careful visual survey of the entire property, his experienced eye detecting details he'd missed in his initial assessment. The subtle berms that provided Victoria with protected lanes of fire, the carefully trimmed branches that eliminated potential cover for attackers, the reinforced shutters designed to withstand concentrated fire. "You've spent 3 years creating a fortress disguised as a homestead," he observed, genuine admiration coloring his tone despite the circumstances. "Every detail calculated, every approach covered. 2 years and 7 months to be precise," Victoria corrected. "The first 5 months were spent surveying the territory and selecting the optimal location. This ridge offers commanding views, defensible approaches, and multiple escape routes if necessary. The sun had risen fully now, illuminating the standoff. In clear morning light, Victoria noted how the men had settled into more cautious positions, their initial confidence replaced by wary respect. Through her mirrors, she watched Sullivan conferring quietly with Davies, the man who had recognized her wartime designation. "Tell me something, Mrs. Harlow," Sullivan called out after a moment. "If you truly are Shadow, why here? Why exchange a legendary military career for isolation in the wilderness?" The question carried genuine curiosity beneath its tactical purpose of keeping her talking. Victoria considered her response, carefully aware that personal information could be both a connection and a vulnerability. The same reason many soldiers sought the frontier after the war. "Captain Sullivan," she replied, "to build something rather than destroy, to find peace after years of violence." She paused, then added, "Though as you've demonstrated today, peace isn't guaranteed even in the most remote locations." Through her mirrors, Victoria caught the brief flash of something like regret cross Sullivan's features before his expression hardened again into tactical assessment. "Our employer doesn't care about your past, Mrs. Harlow," he stated flatly, "only about this land and its strategic value for the coming railroad. His offer remains: vacate voluntarily with compensation or be removed by force." "And who exactly is this employer so interested in my modest homestead?" Victoria questioned, though she already had strong suspicions based on her research. Sullivan hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "A gentleman with significant investments in the Denver and Rio Grande. A man with political connections who ensures his operations proceed without interference. Maxwell Thornton." Victoria supplied, watching satisfaction flash across Sullivan's face at her accurate deduction. Railroad magnate, land speculator, and suspected architect of the mysterious accidents befalling those who obstruct his planned route through the territory. She shifted position again, moving to her western window to maintain coverage of all approaches. "What Thornton hasn't told you, Captain, is that his claim to these lands rests on forged documents. Papers my late husband exposed before his accidental death 3 years ago." The revelation landed like a physical blow among the men. Victoria watched several exchange uneasy glances, their loyalty visibly wavering as they processed this new information. "Thomas Harlow wasn't just my husband," Victoria continued, her voice steady despite the pain of these memories. "He was a federal land agent investigating corruption in territorial acquisitions. His reports to Washington detailed Thornton's entire operation. The bribes, the forgeries, the strategic violence against homesteaders who refused to sell." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Those reports disappeared the day after Thomas was found with a broken neck at the bottom of a ravine. A riding accident, according to the coroner Thornton had in his pocket." Victoria's revelation about her husband's death and Maxwell Thornton's corrupt land dealings hung in the morning air, transforming the standoff once again. Through her strategic observation points, she watched the impact of her words ripple through the men surrounding her cabin. Davies, the limping man who had recognized her military designation earlier, lowered his weapon completely. "Thornton told us this was legal acquisition," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the property. "Said he had proper papers from the territorial office. Thornton has been fabricating legal claims throughout the territory." Victoria responded, maintaining her vigilance on all approaches, using his political connections to have them registered without scrutiny. "My husband discovered the pattern and began building a case against him." From his position behind the oak tree, Sullivan remained silent, his expression unreadable. Victoria could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. The reassessment of his position, his options, and most importantly, his loyalties. "You have no proof of these allegations," he finally called out, though there was a new hesitation in his voice. "The proof is in my possession," Victoria replied calmly. "Copies of the original land grants, documentation of the forgeries, testimonies from territorial officials who were pressured into cooperation, all carefully preserved and distributed to trusted contacts who will release them in the event of my death." She shifted position again, moving to cover the southern approach, where Torres and Davies had been whispering urgently to each other, their body language suggesting growing uncertainty about their mission. "Thornton's paying us good money," Carter growled, though his words seemed directed more at his wavering companions than at Victoria. It doesn't matter the details as long as the gold spends. It matters when hanging judges don't distinguish between hired guns and their employers. Victoria countered. Thornton remains safely in Denver, while you risk your necks carrying out his dirty work. When investigations begin, he'll deny all knowledge of your actions. This struck home with several of the men. Victoria noted how Torres had moved further back from his original position, clearly reconsidering his involvement. Why should we believe you over our employer? Sullivan challenged, though Victoria detected genuine uncertainty beneath his defiant tone. Because unlike Thornton, I'm willing to show you the evidence. She responded, documents that prove he's been systematically defrauding homesteaders in the federal government. Evidence that would implicate anyone associated with his operations. Victoria moved to another firing position, maintaining her tactical advantage, while continuing the psychological dismantling of Sullivan's team. Some of you fought in the war. She noted, her voice steady. You followed orders from men you trusted for causes you believed in. What cause are you serving now beyond lining Thornton's pockets? In the pit beneath her kitchen floor, Hayes had gone very still, absorbing every word of the exchange above him. Victoria heard him murmur something that sounded like, knew this job didn't feel right. Outside, Davies had begun limping away from his position towards Sullivan, clearly intent on conferring with his leader. Victoria allowed this movement, recognizing that fractures were forming within the outlaw ranks. Thornton didn't just target my husband. She continued, pressing her psychological advantage. The accidents that befell the Hanson family and the Wilkinsons followed the same pattern. Suspicious deaths after they refused to sell their land for his proposed railroad route. She paused, letting this sink in. How many of you signed on to become murderers of innocent families? How many would willingly hang for a man who sees you as disposable tools? The impact of her words was visible in how several men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. Through her mirrors, Victoria watched as Torres stepped fully away from the conflict, moving back toward where the horses were tethered. Where do you think you're going, Torres? Carter called out angrily. Rethinking my position, Torres replied evenly. The captain knows I didn't sign up for targeting federal agents or their families. That crosses a line. Sullivan had finished his hushed conversation with Davies, his expression grave as he assessed his rapidly disintegrating operation. Through her specialized sighting equipment, Victoria could see the struggle playing out across his features, the military officer's sense of duty warring with the outlaw leader's pragmatism. Mrs. Harlow. He called finally, his voice carrying a new note of formal respect. I propose a temporary ceasefire to discuss terms. My terms remain unchanged, Victoria replied steadily. You and your men leave my property immediately. With newly acquired information, the parameters of our engagement have shifted. Sullivan responded, falling back on formal military language. I request 10 minutes of discussion to reassess our respective positions. Victoria considered his request, carefully weighing the tactical advantages and risks. A brief negotiation period would allow her to conserve ammunition and potentially divide the gang further, but it also created opportunities for deception. 5 minutes, she countered. Your men maintain their current positions. Any attempt to advance will be met with immediate response. Sullivan nodded his agreement, then turned to confer with Davies and Carter. Through her observation network, Victoria noted how the gang had effectively split into 3 factions. Those still loyal to Sullivan, those who were wavering, and Torres, who had clearly decided to abandon the operation. From the holding pit beneath her kitchen, Hayes called up tentatively. Ma'am, if what you're saying is true about Thornton, I want no part in this. I signed on for pressuring reluctant sellers. Not what happened to your husband. Victoria studied the young man through her observation port. His expression seemed genuinely troubled, though she remained wary of deception. Your concern comes rather late. Mr. Hayes, she noted coolly, didn't know the details before. He insisted. Thornton's man in Denver just said we were helping acquire necessary properties for the railroad progress, for the territory, he called it. Outside, the discussion among the men had grown more heated. Carter was gesturing emphatically, while Sullivan maintained a calm, controlled demeanor. Torres had been joined by another man near the horses, clearly considering following his example. You said you have proof. Sullivan called to Victoria after several minutes of intense deliberation. What exactly do you possess that would implicate Thornton? My husband was meticulous in his investigations. Victoria responded. He compiled ledgers, tracking suspicious land transactions, collected samples of forged documents alongside the originals for comparison, and recorded testimonies from territorial officials who were pressured into cooperation. She paused, then added, most damning of all, he also maintained correspondence with Judge Carlton in Denver. Communications that detailed his suspicions and named Thornton directly as the architect of the fraudulent schemes. This new information landed heavily among the men. Judge Carlton was well known throughout the territory as an incorruptible federal judge who had sent more than one wealthy man to prison despite political connections. If Carlton was involved, why hasn't Thornton been arrested? Challenged Carter, though uncertainty had crept into his belligerent tone. Because the final piece of evidence disappeared the day my husband died, Victoria explained, a document bearing Thornton's signature on instructions for land acquisition by any means necessary. Without it, there wasn't enough for formal charges. She shifted position again, maintaining her tactical advantage while pressing her psychological offensive. That document is now in my possession, recovered from the man Thornton sent to remove it from my husband's effects. This was a calculated risk. The document existed, but Victoria couldn't be certain Thornton had personally signed it rather than using an intermediary. However, the impact of her claim on the Outlaws was immediate and dramatic. Torres immediately mounted his horse. I'm done, he announced clearly. This has gone beyond what I agreed to. Anyone with sense should do the same. Carter raised his rifle, aiming at the departing man. You don't walk away from a job. Lower your weapon, Carter, Sullivan ordered sharply. Killing our own men isn't part of any operation I command. The tension among the men had reached a breaking point. Victoria watched through her mirrors as clear divisions formed. Torres already departing, another man moving uncertainly toward his horse. Davies standing firmly beside Sullivan and Carter, with his one remaining ally maintaining aggressive postures. Our 5 minutes of negotiation has concluded, Captain Sullivan. Victoria called out, What's your decision? The morning sun climbed higher as Nathan Sullivan faced the most challenging tactical decision of his post-war career. Victoria watched through her observation system as the former cavalry officer weighed his increasingly limited options. His operation had unraveled with unexpected speed. Torres already riding away, another man edging toward his horse, and the remaining men divided in their loyalties. Mrs. Harlow. Sullivan called finally, his voice carrying the resigned tone of a military commander, recognizing an untenable position. I propose terms for our disengagement. I'm listening, Victoria replied cautiously, maintaining her vigilance on all approaches. Years of experience had taught her that desperate men were often at their most dangerous when cornered. My men and I will withdraw from your property immediately, Sullivan stated. In exchange, you provide us copies of the evidence against Thornton Insurance for our own protection once he discovers we failed to secure your land. Victoria considered his proposal carefully. Providing documentary evidence would give the men leverage against their employer, potentially protecting them from reprisal. It would also implicate them further in the corruption she sought to expose. Half now, half delivered to Sheriff Hawkins in Silverpine, once I've confirmed your complete withdrawal from the territory. She countered, I'll include sworn statements identifying Thornton as the architect of these operations, not the men following his orders. Before Sullivan could respond, Carter stepped forward from his position, fury evident in his stance. This is ridiculous. We don't negotiate with targets. Thornton is paying us to clear this land, not to run at the first sign of resistance. Stand down, Carter, Sullivan ordered sharply. The tactical situation has changed. Nothing's changed except your backbone, Carter snarled, gesturing toward the cabin. It's still one woman against 4 men. I don't care what fancy title she had during the war. She can't cover all angles at once. Victoria had been anticipating this fracture. Through her mirrors, she watched the remaining men instinctively take sides, one moving closer to Carter, while Davies remained firmly beside Sullivan. You're welcome to test that theory, Mr. Carter, Victoria called calmly. But before you do, you should know that I've documented each of your faces and names connecting you directly to Thornton's operations. That information has already been dispatched to Judge Carlton in Denver. She paused, then added the details she'd been holding in reserve. I've also taken the liberty of documenting your involvement in the incident at the Hanson homestead, particularly your role in setting fire to their barn while the family was still inside. Carter's face paled visibly, his bravado faltering as he realized the extent of Victoria's intelligence gathering. You can't prove a distinctive spur pattern in the mud beside the Hansons' barn. Victoria interrupted. Matching the custom spurs you're wearing right now. The same pattern was documented by the territorial marshal who investigated the scene, but was later pressured to abandon the case. The precision of this detail landed like a physical blow. Victoria watched uncertainty flash across Carter's face, quickly replaced by desperate calculation. She recognized the signs of a man considering his rapidly diminishing options and the dangerous unpredictability that accompanied such a moment. Mrs. Harlow's terms are acceptable, Sullivan announced firmly, reasserting his authority over the fractured group. We withdraw completely in exchange for the documentation she's offered. Speak for yourself, Captain, Carter growled, using Sullivan's former rank mockingly. With a sudden motion, Carter raised his rifle and fired at the cabin's front window. The bullet splintered the wooden frame as Victoria ducked smoothly below the sill, having anticipated this reaction. Carter, stand down, Sullivan shouted, but the situation had already escalated beyond his control. Taking Carter's shot as a signal, his ally opened fire on the cabin as well, forcing Sullivan and Davies to dive for cover to avoid being caught in the crossfire. The unified operation had dissolved into chaos, exactly as Victoria had calculated. From her protected position, Victoria sighted carefully through a narrow gap in the shutters. Carter was directing his ally to spread out, attempting to create multiple angles of fire on the cabin. It was a sound tactical approach against a conventional opponent, but Victoria had designed her defenses specifically to counter such strategies. She fired a precise shot that struck the ground between Carter's feet, forcing him back behind the water trough. That was your final warning, Mr. Carter, she called out, her voice steady, despite the escalating violence. The next one won't miss. In the confusion, the wavering outlaw had made his decision, mounting his horse and following Torres's earlier departure. This left only Carter and his single ally actively engaged against the cabin, with Sullivan and Davies caught in an increasingly precarious neutral position. Inside the pit beneath her kitchen, Hayes called up anxiously, Mrs. Harlow, I want no part in Carter's foolishness. If you let me out, I swear I'll ride straight out of the territory. Victoria assessed the young man's sincerity through her observation port. His fear appeared genuine, as did his desire to distance himself from the escalating conflict. There's a release lever on the eastern support beam, she instructed him. Pull it once, then move to the corner nearest the stove. Hayes quickly located the mechanism and activated it. A section of the kitchen floor hinged downward, creating a ramp leading to a narrow tunnel that emerged behind the stable, an escape route Victoria had engineered during her second year of residence. Follow the tunnel, she directed. It will lead you behind your horses. Take the chestnut mare with the white blaze. She's fast but gentle. Ride south towards Silver Pine and turn yourself in to Sheriff Hawkins. Tell him everything about Thornton's operation. Septum. Yes, ma'am, Hayes agreed hastily, already scrambling toward the tunnel entrance. Thank you for the chance. Outside, Carter had organized his remaining ally into a more coordinated assault. The man had worked his way toward the woodpile on the western approach, while Carter himself was attempting to maneuver toward the blind spot near the chimney. A vulnerability Victoria had deliberately crafted to appear more significant than it actually was. Through her network of mirrors, Victoria observed Sullivan and Davies engaged in urgent discussion while maintaining cover from the ongoing gunfire. The former captain's expression showed the calculating assessment of a trained officer evaluating a chaotic battlefield. Victoria moved to her next firing position, preparing to counter Carter's advance. The outlaw had reached the corner of the cabin, where the chimney created an apparent dead zone in her fields of fire. What he didn't realize was that Victoria had installed a specialized firing port in the chimney itself, concealed behind a removable brick. She detected movement outside this port. Carter edging closer, believing himself protected from her observation. Victoria removed the brick silently and peered through the narrow opening. Carter was less than 10 feet away, his attention focused on the cabin's windows rather than the chimney itself. I wouldn't take another step if I were you, Mr. Carter, Victoria called calmly through the port. Carter froze, shock evident in his posture as he realized his supposedly safe approach had been anticipated. Before he could react, Victoria fired a precise shot that splintered the stock of his rifle, rendering the weapon useless without injuring the man himself. Carter stumbled backward, cursing as he drew his sidearm. Victoria had already moved to another position, maintaining her tactical advantage through constant mobility. From her new vantage point, she spotted Carter's ally, attempting to circle behind the stable, likely hoping to use it as cover for approaching the rear of the cabin. Victoria fired again, the bullet striking a metal bucket hanging beside the stable door. The loud clang startled the man, causing him to lose his footing and tumble down the slight incline, effectively neutralizing his advance. "Your men are exposed, Mr. Carter," Victoria called out, "and your position is compromised." From their protected location behind the oak tree, Sullivan finally made his decision. "Carter," he shouted, "this operation is terminated. Stand down immediately. This operation is finished." Sullivan repeated, his voice carrying the unmistakable command tone of a military officer. "Stand down, Carter." Carter responded with a string of profanities, his face contorted with rage as he took cover behind the water trough once more. "You've gone soft, Captain," he spat. "Thornton's paying us good money to clear this land, and I aim to earn my share." Through her observation network, Victoria watched the final disintegration of what had once been a coordinated assault. Carter's remaining ally had taken up a position that isolated him from Sullivan and Davies, effectively creating two separate factions in what had begun as a unified operation. "Think, Carter." Sullivan urged, maintaining his position behind the oak tree. "The woman has outmaneuvered us at every turn. She's documented our operations, connected us to Thornton, and prepared this entire property as a defensive position. We're fighting on ground of her choosing against an opponent with superior tactical awareness." Victoria used this moment of distraction to relocate to yet another firing position. Her system of concealed handholds and reinforced paths allowed her to move silently throughout the cabin's interior, appearing at different windows to maintain the impression of multiple defenders. Carter signaled to his ally, directing him toward the eastern approach while he maintained covering fire. It was a basic flanking maneuver, but executed with the desperation of a man who knew his options were rapidly diminishing. "Your men are still exposed, Mr. Carter," Victoria called calmly, "and now divided. Do you really want to risk their lives for a man who would deny all knowledge of your actions if captured?" To emphasize her point, Victoria fired a precise shot that ricocheted off a metal feeding trough near Carter's ally, sending him scrambling for better cover. The shot demonstrated both her accuracy and her continued choice to disable rather than kill, a psychological tactic that further undermined the Outlaws' resolve. From his position behind the oak tree, Sullivan had begun executing a different strategy. Victoria observed him removing his gun belt and raising his hand slightly, signaling his intention to approach under truce. "Mrs. Harlow," he called out, "request permission to approach under white flag to discuss terms of full withdrawal." Victoria considered his proposal carefully. Years of experience had taught her to be wary of such offers, particularly when other hostile forces remained active. However, Sullivan's military background suggested he would respect the protocols of parley. "Permission granted, Captain Sullivan," she responded, advanced slowly with Davies. "Any attempt to use this approach as cover for hostile action will be met with immediate response." As Sullivan and Davies began their cautious approach toward the cabin's front porch, Carter's fury reached new heights. "Traitors!" he shouted, firing wildly in their direction and forcing them to dive for cover. Victoria had anticipated this reaction. She fired a rapid series of shots that pinned down Carter and his ally, protecting Sullivan and Davies as they scrambled behind a woodpile closer to the cabin. "Carter's lost control," Sullivan called to Victoria, keeping his head down as bullets splintered wood around him. "He's as much a threat to us as to you now." "Then our interests are temporarily aligned," Victoria observed, coolly maintaining her tactical advantage. "What do you propose? A coordinated effort to neutralize Carter and his man?" Sullivan suggested, "followed by our complete withdrawal from your property with the evidence we discussed." Victoria weighed this proposal against her other options. Allowing Sullivan and Davies to assist would reduce the immediate threat, but creating any alliance with them carried its own risks. Before she could respond, the sound of galloping hooves drew everyone's attention. Through her mirrors, Victoria spotted Hayes emerging from behind the stable on her chestnut mare, making a desperate dash toward the southern trail. Carter immediately redirected his fire toward the fleeing man. "Cover Hayes's escape," Victoria instructed Sullivan, shifting her own position to get a clear shot at Carter Sullivan, and Davies responded immediately, laying down suppressive fire that forced Carter and his ally to seek better cover. Their coordinated action allowed Hayes to make it safely into the tree line and disappear down the trail toward Silver Pine. The temporary alliance shifted the tactical balance decisively. With Sullivan and Davies now actively opposing them, Carter and his ally found themselves outflanked and outgunned. "Last chance, Carter." Sullivan called out, "Drop your weapons and withdraw. There's nothing to be gained here except bullets." "You're a dead man, Sullivan," Carter snarled back. "You think Thornton will just let you walk away after this? He'll hunt you down like a dog." "Not if we have insurance," Sullivan replied steadily, glancing toward the cabin where Victoria maintained her vigilant watch. Carter's response was a renewed barrage of gunfire, more desperate than accurate. His ally attempted to circle behind the stable for a better angle, not realizing he was moving directly into one of Victoria's prepared fields of fire. "Your man by the stable should reconsider his approach," Victoria called to Carter. "That position is covered by 3 separate firing angles." To demonstrate, she fired a shot that struck the dirt at the man's feet, followed by another that clipped the brim of his hat. The man froze, then wisely dropped his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "Jenkins is out," Davies reported, his experienced eye noting the change in the tactical situation. "That leaves just Carter." The momentum had shifted irrevocably. Carter found himself isolated, abandoned by his ally, and facing 3 opponents. His options had dwindled to surrender or suicidal resistance. "It's over, Carter," Sullivan called, his voice carrying the weight of tactical certainty. "You're alone and exposed. Surrender while you still can." Victoria watched Carter carefully through her specialized sight. His body language revealed the dangerous unpredictability of a cornered predator. Shoulders tense, movements, jerky eyes darting between potential targets. She recognized the signs of a man preparing for one final desperate action. "Mr. Carter is considering a suicide charge," she observed calmly to Sullivan. "His right hand is tensing, and he's shifting his weight onto his back foot for momentum." Sullivan nodded in acknowledgement, impressed despite himself by the precision of her observation. Carter always was hot-headed, too quick to act, too slow to think. As predicted, Carter suddenly burst from behind his cover, firing wildly as he charged toward the cabin with reckless abandon. Victoria had already anticipated this move, having observed similar desperate charges during the war. She fired a precisely calculated shot that struck Carter's right shoulder, causing him to spin and drop his weapon without inflicting a fatal wound. Carter fell hard, clutching his injured shoulder and cursing vehemently. The final threat neutralized, and uneasy silence fell over the property. "Your marksmanship remains impressive, Mrs. Harlow," Sullivan noted, stepping cautiously from behind the woodpile. "You could have killed him easily at that range." "Killing should always be the last resort," Victoria replied, maintaining her position at the window. "A lesson the war taught me at great cost." She studied Sullivan carefully through her sight as he approached Carter's prone form and secured the man's dropped weapons. Despite their temporary alignment against a common threat, Victoria remained vigilantly aware that Sullivan and Davies still represented potential dangers. "Your proposal?" "Captain Sullivan," she called, redirecting the conversation to their interrupted negotiation. "You mentioned a coordinated withdrawal and evidence against Thornton. Let's discuss specific terms." Sullivan straightened his military bearing, returning now that the immediate threat had been neutralized. "Complete withdrawal from your property and the surrounding territory. No further action against you or your land. In exchange, documentary evidence of Thornton's operations sufficient to protect us from his reprisals." Victoria considered his terms carefully. "And what guarantee do I have that you won't simply return with reinforcements once you've secured the evidence?" Sullivan considered Victoria's question with the thoughtful calculation of a military strategist. My word as an officer means little after my actions since the war, he acknowledged candidly, but practical considerations offer better assurance than promises. Thornton has connections, but his reach isn't infinite. With evidence of his operations in our possession, mutual deterrence becomes our protection. Victoria maintained her vigilant position at the window, assessing both Sullivan's words and his body language through her specialized sight. Years of experience reading men in high-pressure situations told her his pragmatic approach was genuine, even if his trustworthiness remained questionable. There's another factor you should consider, she noted calmly. Young Hayes is currently riding to Silverpine with instructions to share everything he knows about Thornton's operations with Sheriff Hawkins. By tomorrow, territorial marshals will be investigating every aspect of these land acquisitions. This new information visibly impacted Sullivan's tactical calculations. He exchanged a quick glance with Davies, their wordless communication revealing the depth of their partnership. Then our window for establishing independent protection is closing rapidly. Sullivan observed, making our need for the documentation more urgent, not less. On the ground nearby, Carter groaned and clutched his wounded shoulder, his earlier bravado replaced by pained resignation. Jenkins, the man who had surrendered earlier, remained kneeling with his hands raised, uncertain of his fate as the negotiation continued. Your practical assessment is sound. Victoria acknowledged, but incomplete documentation sufficient to protect you from Thornton would also implicate you in his crimes. A difficult position when territorial marshals begin making arrests. Sullivan nodded, accepting the validity of her point. Then perhaps alternative terms might be more appropriate to our mutual interests. I'm listening, Victoria replied, still maintaining her tactical advantage despite the evolving situation. Complete withdrawal as offered previously, Sullivan began, his tone shifting to the formal cadence of official negotiation. Plus our testimony against Thornton regarding his operations and methods. In exchange, your intervention with the territorial authorities. Verification that Davies, myself, and our men cooperated in bringing Thornton to justice. Victoria considered this revised proposal carefully. Having former outlaws testify against Thornton would significantly strengthen the case against him, potentially ensuring that justice would reach beyond mere triggermen to the true architect of the corruption. Testimony would need to be comprehensive, she stated. Every detail of Thornton's operations, every instruction he provided, every official he compromised. Understood and agreed, Sullivan confirmed. Davies and I maintained meticulous records of all operations, names, dates, payments. Thornton insisted on detailed reporting. Your organizational tendencies from military service, Victoria observed, useful now in unexpected ways. Davies spoke up for the first time during the negotiation, his voice carrying the practical perspective of a seasoned veteran. Thornton never suspected we'd keep our own set of records. Insurance, we called it, never thought we'd actually need it. Through her specialized sight, Victoria studied both men carefully. Their body language suggested genuine willingness to cooperate, driven more by self-preservation than any sudden moral awakening. Pragmatism rather than principle, but effective nonetheless for her purposes. And Carter? She inquired, nodding toward the wounded man still lying in the dirt. Carter was running his own side operations without Thornton's knowledge. Sullivan revealed, including the more extreme violence against the Hanson family. His testimony would be valuable but problematic. He's directly implicated in multiple deaths. This explanation aligned with Victoria's own intelligence gathering. She had suspected Carter's particularly vicious approach went beyond Thornton's instructions, representing personal initiative rather than ordered action. Very well, she decided, I accept your revised terms with one addition. You'll surrender all weapons before approaching the cabin, and you'll be secured inside until arrangements can be made with Sheriff Hawkins. Sullivan nodded his acceptance, recognizing the reasonable precaution. Agreed, and Jenkins. Victoria considered the surrendered outlaw who had maintained his kneeling position throughout the negotiation. He'll be secured as well, pending determination of his specific involvement. With terms established, Victoria directed the careful disarming process from her protected position. Sullivan and Davies removed their remaining weapons, placing them in a pile before approaching the cabin with hands visible. Jenkins followed their example while Carter remained secured where he had fallen, his wound painful but not life-threatening. "Stop at the porch steps," Victoria instructed. "You'll find restraints hanging on the railing posts. Secure yourselves, and then proceed inside." Sullivan raised an eyebrow at this prepared detail. "You anticipated taking prisoners." "I anticipated multiple scenarios," Victoria corrected calmly. "Preparation for diverse outcomes was essential to my operational planning during the war. Old habits persist." Curry. Once the men had secured themselves with the specialized restraints designed to allow limited movement while preventing access to weapons, Victoria directed them into the cabin through the front door. Only after they were safely inside did she emerge from her firing position, maintaining a careful distance as she verified their bonds. Impressive modifications. Sullivan noted his experienced eye taking in the cabin's interior defenses, now visible from his new perspective. The reinforced walls, the concealed firing ports, the observation system. "You've created a defensive position that would challenge a full military unit." 3 years of methodical preparation. Victoria acknowledged checking Carter's wound as the sullen outlaw sat heavily in a kitchen chair. "The bleeding is controlled. You'll survive to face justice, Mr. Carter." With her prisoners secured, Victoria retrieved a medical kit from beneath a floorboard and tended to Carter's injury with clinical efficiency. Her actions were neither gentle nor rough, simply the practical administrations of someone who had treated many battlefield wounds. "Why bother?" Carter muttered, wincing as she cleaned and bandaged his shoulder. "You should have finished the job." "Killing is easy, Mr. Carter," Victoria replied evenly. "Living with the consequences is harder. I learned that lesson thoroughly during the war." While maintaining vigilant awareness of her prisoners, Victoria moved to a concealed compartment behind a false section of bookshelf. From this hidden space, she retrieved a leather portfolio containing carefully preserved documents. "These are copies of essential evidence," she explained, spreading selected papers on the table. "Sufficient to demonstrate Thornton's operations and your cooperation against him without unnecessarily incriminating yourselves in matters unrelated to his land acquisition scheme." Sullivan studied the documents with obvious admiration for their thorough organization. "Your husband taught you his investigative methods?" "Thomas taught me many things," Victoria confirmed, a momentary softness entering her voice before her professional demeanor returned. "But my organizational systems were developed during intelligence operations behind Confederate lines when information could mean the difference between mission success and capture. Meticulous documentation becomes second nature." She separated specific documents into distinct piles, her movements precise and deliberate. "These will go to Sheriff Hawkins, these to Judge Carlton directly, and these will remain secured as insurance against future complications." As Victoria organized the evidence, the morning had progressed to full-day sunlight, streaming through the cabin's windows and illuminating dust motes disturbed by their movement. The transformation from pre-dawn tension to this strange aftermath created an almost surreal atmosphere. "I must admit," Mrs. Harlow Sullivan observed, watching her systematic approach to the documentation. "When Thornton assigned us this operation, I anticipated many potential outcomes. Finding myself negotiating surrender terms with a former Union intelligence operative was not among them." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows, Victoria maintained her vigilant supervision of her prisoners while completing the organization of evidence. The atmosphere had shifted from combat tension to an uneasy truce, punctuated by the occasional groan from Carter as his wounded shoulder throbbed. "Thornton will have contingency plans," Sullivan observed, breaking the extended silence. "He didn't build his empire by leaving himself vulnerable to betrayal." Victoria nodded, acknowledging the validity of his concern. "He already implemented one such contingency 2 weeks ago. A professional gunman visited Silver Pine asking questions about the widow who lives alone in the hills. Fortunately, the townsfolk are protective of their own." This information visibly surprised Sullivan. "Thornton sent someone in advance of our operation. He never mentioned this compartmentalization," Victoria explained. "A principle I suspect you understand from your military experience. Each operative receives only the information necessary for their specific task." Davies shifted uncomfortably in his restraints. "What happened to this gunman?" A ghost of a smile touched Victoria's lips. He encountered unexpected difficulty during his reconnaissance. A regrettable accident involving a weakened bridge on the North Trail. He's currently recovering from 2 broken legs in Sheriff Hawkins' jail and providing additional testimony against Thornton. I imagine, precisely, Sullivan noted with grim appreciation. Victoria sealed one of the document packets with wax, pressing her husband's official seal into the molten surface. Through the cabin's windows, the distant sound of approaching horses caught everyone's attention. Victoria moved smoothly to her observation position, using her network of mirrors to identify the riders without exposing herself directly. "Sheriff Hawkins," she announced after a moment, accompanied by young Hayes and 2 deputies, "it seems your former associate delivered my message with commendable speed." Sullivan straightened in his chair, military bearing, returning despite his restraints. "He'll have described our operation in detail. Not the most favorable first impression. Actions have consequences, Captain," Victoria replied evenly, though without malice. "But your current cooperation will be noted as agreed." She moved to the door, opening it just as Sheriff Richard Hawkins and his men reined in their horses before the cabin. The sheriff, a weathered man in his 50s with shrewd eyes that missed little, surveyed the scene with professional assessment. "Mrs. Harlow," he called, tipping his hat politely, despite the tension evident in his posture. "Young Hayes here tells quite a tale. Says you've been holding off the entire Sullivan gang, single-handed since dawn." "A somewhat simplified account," Victoria responded, gesturing toward the open door. 4 prisoners secured inside, 1 wounded but stable. 2 more fled earlier. Torres and Jenkins, whose names I've documented. Hawkins dismounted, signaling his deputies to secure the perimeter. His experienced gaze took in the subtle modifications to the cabin, the strategic positioning of windows, the carefully maintained clear lines of fire. "You've been planning for something like this," he observed quietly as he approached the porch. "Planning for possibilities." Victoria corrected, "a habit developed during the war." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. "War, you say, wouldn't be referring to your time with the Phantom Division? Would you, Shadow?" A momentary silence followed his words. Victoria studied Hawkins with new intensity, reassessing everything she thought she knew about the seemingly provincial sheriff. Few recognized that designation. She noted carefully, Hawkins removed his hat, revealing a faded scar that ran from his temple into his hairline. "Captain Michael Hawkins, 3rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, attached to Special Operations Command, under Colonel Harker from 63 to 65. I was the supply officer who ensured your team had what they needed for the Chattanooga operation." Recognition dawned in Victoria's eyes. The quartermaster who somehow procured Confederate uniforms with exactly the right regimental insignia? "Your attention to detail saved lives," Hawkins replied, a new respect evident in his tone. "And your team's intelligence gathering saved hundreds more." He glanced toward the cabin interior. "When you settled in my jurisdiction 3 years ago, I wondered if it was coincidence. Now I'm thinking it wasn't." Victoria gestured toward the interior of the cabin. "This conversation might be better continued inside, with reference to certain documents." "Sasharinom." Hawkins nodded his understanding, following her into the cabin where the prisoners watched this unexpected reunion with growing unease. The sheriff assessed each man with the practiced eye of a veteran lawman before turning his attention to the document packets Victoria had prepared. "Thornton," he stated, rather than examining the evidence. "I've suspected his involvement in territorial corruption for years, but could never prove it. However, my husband assembled most of this evidence," Victoria explained, indicating the most comprehensive packet. "Thomas was building a case against Thornton's entire operation when he died in that riding accident 3 years ago." Hawkins's expression hardened. "I never believed that was an accident. The terrain where they found him was too familiar to an experienced rider." "It wasn't," Victoria confirmed quietly. "But proving murder requires evidence I've only recently secured." She removed a folded paper from a hidden pocket sewn into her dress. This letter in Thornton's handwriting instructing his agent to ensure Harlow's permanent silence regarding the land claims investigation. The sheriff examined the document with careful attention, his experienced eye noting the distinctive handwriting and personal seal. "Where did you obtain this?" "From the effects of Thornton's agent after he attempted to eliminate me 6 months ago," Victoria replied. "He'd preserved it as insurance against his employer, a common practice among those who serve corrupt men. Unfortunately for him, his ambush planning lacked the tactical awareness his mission required." Hawkins glanced up sharply. "You never reported an attempt on your life. Some matters are better handled directly," Victoria stated simply. The man survived with valuable lessons about choosing his employers more carefully. He's currently operating a small trading post in Nevada, having decided a change of scenery was advisable for his health. From his seat at the table, Sullivan watched this exchange with growing understanding. "You've been systematically dismantling Thornton's operation since you arrived," he observed, "using your husband's evidence as a foundation. Completing Thomas's work," Victoria corrected, "and ensuring that his death served purpose beyond Thornton's ambitions." She turned her attention back to Hawkins. "With these men's testimony and the consolidated evidence, we have sufficient material to present Judge Carlton with an irrefutable case against Thornton and his entire organization." Hawkins nodded his agreement after examining the documents further. "Carlton has been looking for an opportunity to move against Thornton for years. This will give him everything he needs to issue warrants for the entire operation. Where Thornton has protection in Denver," Carter interjected bitterly from his position at the table. "Politicians, businessmen, even a few judges, they won't let him fall easily." "Perhaps," Victoria acknowledged, "but corruption requires darkness to thrive. Once exposed to sufficient light, even the most entrenched corruption becomes vulnerable." She indicated a specific document in the evidence packet. "This list identifies every official who has accepted payments from Thornton over the past 5 years, including amounts, dates, and the specific actions purchased with each payment." Hawkins whistled softly as he reviewed the detailed accounting. "This will shake the territorial government to its foundations. Reform often requires disruption," Victoria noted calmly. "Thomas believed the territory deserved honest governance, ensuring that outcome seems an appropriate memorial." Outside, the deputies had begun securing the perimeter of the property, collecting discarded weapons, and examining the positions Sullivan's men had occupied during the confrontation. Through the window, Victoria observed Hayes describing the morning's events to the deputies, his animated gestures suggesting the story was growing more dramatic with each telling. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Victoria's property as Sheriff Hawkins organized the secure transport of the prisoners. Deputies had fashioned a makeshift stretcher for Carter, whose wounded shoulder required medical attention beyond Victoria's initial treatment. Sullivan and Davies would ride with their hands bound, while Jenkins would walk alongside the horses. "We should move them before dark," Hawkins advised, checking the restraints on each prisoner personally. "The road to Silver Pine gets treacherous after sunset, especially with prisoners." Victoria nodded her agreement, though her attention had shifted to something beyond the immediate situation. A subtle tension had entered her posture, her gaze repeatedly scanning the distant ridgeline, visible through her eastern window. "Something's troubling you," Hawkins observed, quietly noticing her vigilance. "Thornton's thoroughness," she replied, keeping her voice low enough that the prisoners couldn't overhear. "The contingency Sullivan mentioned earlier. It's been activated by now. Their failure to return on schedule would trigger predetermined countermeasures." Hawkins's expression darkened with understanding. "You're expecting additional visitors?" "I would in Thornton's position," Victoria confirmed, moving to check her ammunition supplies. "He doesn't tolerate failure, and he protects himself by eliminating potential witnesses. These men know too much to be allowed to reach a courtroom." The sheriff absorbed this assessment with the gravity of a veteran who recognized legitimate threat analysis. "How would he know they've been captured rather than delayed?" "Thornton employs telegraph operators in strategic locations," Victoria explained, retrieving her specialized sight from its concealed compartment, "including one in Miller's Creek 15 miles west. Routine updates would be expected, and their absence would signal compromise." She attached the sight to her Winchester with practiced efficiency, her movements fluid and precise. Additionally, Torres and the other deserter would likely seek protection by alerting Thornton's agents to the situation here. Hawkins processed this information quickly, military experience evident in how swiftly he shifted from law enforcement to tactical thinking. How many would he send, and when? Professional operators, not common outlaws. Victoria assessed probably 4 to 6 men with specialized skills. They would have deployed by mid-morning after the first missed check-in, which puts their arrival within the next hour if they're traveling at standard pace. From his position at the table, Sullivan had been listening intently despite their lowered voices. "She's right," he confirmed, abandoning the pretense. "Thornton maintains a security team separate from our operation. Former Pinkerton and military men discharged for excessive force. They handle problems deemed too sensitive for regular channels." Victoria met his gaze directly, names and descriptions. Sullivan hesitated only briefly before making his decision. William Harding leads them. Former Army Scout expert tracker Abel Forrest. Ex-Pinkerton specializes in quiet eliminations. Brothers Thomas and James Reed, sharpshooters from Burden's unit during the war. And Victor Sanchez, knife expert with experience in border conflicts. Victoria nodded her appreciation for this critical intelligence. 5 operators with complementary skills. A formidable response team. More dangerous than any of us, Sullivan added, nodding toward his fellow prisoners. They don't issue warnings or make demands. They simply eliminate problems with maximum efficiency. Hawkins turned to his deputies who had been preparing the horses for transport. "Change of plans. We're staying to secure the location. Harrison, post yourself at the north approach. Williams, cover the trail from the east, maintain concealment and signal at first sight of riders." The deputies responded with immediate professionalism, retrieving their rifles and moving to their assigned positions without question. Young Hayes, who had been helping secure the horses, looked uncertainly toward the sheriff. "What about me, sir?" Hawkins considered the young man thoughtfully. "You demonstrated courage by bringing a warning to town. Now I need you to demonstrate discretion. Ride to Judge Carlton's office in Denver. Take the South Trail to avoid interception. Deliver this packet directly to him. No one else." The sheriff handed Hayes the sealed document pouch Victoria had prepared earlier. The young man accepted it with solemn understanding of its importance. "I won't fail you, sir, or you, Mrs. Harlow." Victoria approached Hayes, making a minor adjustment to his saddle before meeting his gaze directly. "The southeastern trail passes through Maple Canyon. There's a natural spring 2 miles in where you should water your horse. Behind the large boulder beside the spring, you'll find a cache containing food ammunition in a second sealed packet. Add that to the documents you're carrying." Hayes's eyes widened at this revelation of her extensive preparation. "You've planned for every possibility, haven't you?" "Planning reduces the role of chance in determining outcomes," Victoria replied simply. "Now go before the light fades further." As Hayes galloped south, Victoria returned her attention to securing the cabin for the approaching threat. She moved methodically through each room, checking firing angles, ammunition placements, and defensive positions. "Your contingencies are impressive," Hawkins observed as he helped position extra ammunition at strategic points throughout the cabin. Most people wouldn't have anticipated Thornton sending a professional team to eliminate his own men. "Understanding your opponent's patterns reveals their likely responses," Victoria explained, adjusting a mirror to provide better coverage of the western approach. "Thornton has eliminated his own operatives on at least 3 previous occasions when operations were compromised. It's a predictable response from a man who values security over loyalty." From his seat at the table, Davies watched their preparations with growing concern. "These men won't approach carelessly like we did," he warned. "They'll study the terrain, identify defensive weaknesses, and develop a coordinated assault plan before making any move." I'm counting on their thoroughness," Victoria confirmed. "Professional caution extends their observation time, which gives us additional preparation advantages." She turned to Sullivan, whose military experience made him the most valuable tactical resource among the prisoners. "If you were leading Thornton's response team, how would you approach this situation?" Sullivan considered the question carefully, his strategic mind engaging with the hypothetical scenario. "I'd establish surveillance from the northern ridge, first studying patterns and movements. Then I'd position shooters on elevated positions to the east and west, creating crossfire zones covering all exits. The main assault would come from the south, using the tree line for cover until the final approach. Victoria nodded, having already anticipated similar tactics. And timing. Dusk. Sullivan replied without hesitation. The transitional light creates visual confusion for defenders, while providing sufficient visibility for coordinated movement, approximately 30 minutes from now. Hawkins checked his pocket watch, confirming Sullivan's estimate. That gives us limited time to enhance our defensive posture. The primary defenses are already established, Victoria assured him, moving to a concealed cabinet beneath the kitchen floorboards. From this hidden compartment, she retrieved additional specialized equipment, signal flares, tripwires, and small mechanical devices Hawkins didn't immediately recognize. Perimeter alarms, she explained, noting his curious expression. They'll alert us to movement in specific zones without revealing our awareness of the intrusion. She handed several of the devices to Hawkins. These need to be positioned along the southern tree line, spaced approximately 20 yards apart. They're designed to blend with the natural environment while detecting movement through vibration sensors. As Hawkins examined the sophisticated devices, his expression revealed new appreciation for Victoria's level of preparation. These aren't standard military issue. Thomas designed them, she explained, a brief softness entering her voice. He combined his knowledge of land, surveying equipment, with mechanical innovations he developed during the war. The prototypes proved effective against Confederate night operations in the Shenandoah campaign. While Hawkins departed to position the perimeter sensors, Victoria turned her attention to the prisoners. The tactical situation had created an unusual dynamic. Their safety now depended on the successful defense of the cabin against Thornton's elimination team. Your restraints create vulnerability in a combat situation, she observed clinically, a calculated risk balanced against the possibility of internal threat. Sullivan met her gaze directly. In these circumstances, our interests align perfectly. Thornton's team won't distinguish between you and us once they attack. We're all witnesses to be eliminated. Victoria considered this assessment, weighing tactical pragmatism against security concerns. After a moment's calculation, she made her decision. Davies, you served as a sharpshooter in the 2nd Massachusetts before joining Sullivan's operation, she stated rather than asked. Davies' surprise at her knowledge was evident. How did you? The callus pattern on your trigger finger indicates long rifle training, Victoria explained. And you instinctively assessed range and wind conditions when you first approached the cabin, habits developed through specialist training. She unlocked his restraints with a small key from her pocket. The northwest window provides coverage of the likely sniper position on the ridge. There's a Sharps rifle positioned there with appropriate ammunition. Your skills would be better utilized defending that approach than sitting bound at this table. Dusk settled over the forest surrounding Victoria's cabin, casting long shadows that blurred the distinction between solid objects and their darkening silhouettes. Inside, a coordinated defense had taken shape with surprising efficiency. Davies manned the northwest window, the Sharps rifle positioned perfectly for his specialized skills. Sheriff Hawkins had returned from placing the perimeter sensors and now covered the southern approach. Victoria maintained her mobile defense strategy, moving between positions to maximize coverage of all vulnerable points. Even Sullivan had been conditionally released from his restraints, though Victoria had assigned him to a position where Hawkins could monitor him while he covered the eastern window with a Spencer carbine. First signal trip, Victoria announced quietly, noting the subtle indicator light that had illuminated on a small wooden box near the kitchen. Northern perimeter, approximately 80 yards out. They're being cautious testing for defensive measures. Hawkins nodded, adjusting his position slightly to maintain coverage while reducing his own visibility. Williams would have signaled if they'd approached from the east trail. They're moving through the forest instead, using terrain to mask their approach. Standard procedure for Thornton's team. Sullivan confirmed his military assessment, aligning with Victoria's. Harding will have them spread in a semicircle, maintaining communication through predetermined signals. Another indicator light activated on Victoria's monitoring device. Western perimeter. Now they're establishing containment before committing to assault positions. Davies shifted the Sharps rifle, minutely compensating for the fading light with practiced adjustment of his sight picture. Movement on the ridge. He reported softly, "Single figure setting up position, range approximately 300 yards. That'll be Thomas Reed." Sullivan identified the more patient of the brothers. He specializes in overwatch positions while James typically takes mobile shooting roles. Victoria moved to a specialized observation port near her chimney, using her custom-designed optics to scan the northern ridge. Through the enhanced sight, she located the distant figure, a man setting up a professional shooting position with methodical precision. He's establishing a final firing position. She analyzed, but hasn't mounted his scope yet. "We have perhaps 3 minutes before he's fully operational." Hawkins glanced at her quickly. "Recommendations. Davies has the necessary angle and equipment," Victoria replied, turning to the former outlaw. "Can you make that shot with the current light conditions?" Davies assessed the challenge with professional detachment. 300 yards with this sharps, yes, with proper elevation. But if I miss, we lose the element of surprise." "You won't miss," Victoria stated with quiet certainty. "Your shooting stance has the precision of someone who is an expert at ranges beyond 500 yards. The callus patterns on your hands match those of dedicated long-range marksmen." Davies blinked, surprised by her confidence in his abilities based on such subtle observations. With renewed determination, he settled into position, adjusting the rifle's elevation with meticulous care. "Wait for my signal," Victoria instructed, moving to check another perimeter indicator that had just activated southern approach, now compromised. They're establishing a complete cordon. Through her observation network, Victoria tracked the methodical deployment of Thornton's team. Their professionalism was evident in their patient-coordinated approach, so different from the initial assault by Sullivan's men that morning. These were experienced operators who understood the principles of tactical advantage. "Ready," Davies whispered, his breathing controlled as he maintained perfect sight alignment on the distant figure. Victoria waited for the precise moment when the team would be most vulnerable. Committed to their positions, but not yet fully prepared to execute their assault. Years of combat experience had taught her to recognize this critical window when attackers were most exposed. "Now," she directed calmly. Davies exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The Sharp's rifle cracked sharply in the quiet evening air. Through her specialized optics, Victoria watched the distant figure on the ridge jerk backward, dropping his equipment as he clutched his shoulder and scrambled for cover. "Hit," Davies confirmed. "Clean through the right shoulder, non-lethal as requested." "Well placed," Victoria acknowledged, already moving to her next position. "Sheriff, they'll accelerate their timeline now. Expect immediate response from the southern approach." Hawkins nodded grimly, adjusting his covers to anticipate the reaction. Within moments, movement erupted along the tree line as Thornton's team abandoned their measured approach in favor of immediate action. Two figures moving rapidly from the west, Sullivan reported from his position, using alternating cover patterns. Definitely Forrest and Sanchez based on their movement styles. Victoria had anticipated this response. She triggered one of her prepared defensive measures, a series of pre-positioned signal flares that ignited simultaneously along the western approach. The sudden illumination caught the advancing men in exposed positions, momentarily blinding them and disrupting their coordinated movement. "South clear," Hawkins called, having checked his sector during the distraction. "East approach still secure," Sullivan confirmed. Through her network of mirrors, Victoria tracked the disoriented operators as they sought new cover from the unexpected illumination. Their professional discipline was evident even in how they responded to the setback. No wasted movement, no panicked reactions. "They'll regroup and attempt simultaneous approach from multiple directions," she predicted, moving to activate another defensive system. "Standard response to unexpected resistance." Sullivan agreed. From his position at the northwest window, Davies tracked movement with his reloaded Sharps. Second shooter establishing position on the western ridge, attempting to use trees for concealment. James Reed, I'd guess. He'll try for quick shots between coverage rather than fixed position shooting. Sullivan identified. Victoria moved to the western window, bringing her Winchester to bear. Through her specialized sight, she located the second sharpshooter as he attempted to establish a firing position that balanced concealment with effective angle. "I have him," she stated calmly, then fired a precisely calculated shot that splintered the tree bark inches from Reed's head, sending wooden fragments into his face and forcing him to abandon his position. As the tactical exchange continued, a new figure appeared at the edge of the forest, a well-dressed man in an expensive coat flanked by two armed guards. Even in the fading light, his commanding presence and aristocratic bearing marked him as someone accustomed to authority. "Thornton," Victoria whispered, recognizing the man from the photographs in her husband's files. "He's come himself." Hawkins stared in disbelief. "That's unexpected. He never puts himself in harm's way." "He doesn't trust others to handle failure," Sullivan explained tensely. "When operations go wrong, he sometimes appears to take personal control." Victoria's expression hardened as she studied the man responsible for her husband's death. For 3 years she had prepared for this moment, gathering evidence, building her case, and creating the fortress that would enable her to face him on her terms. "He's carrying a speaking trumpet," she observed through her specialized optics, preparing to issue demands or offer terms. Sure enough, Thornton raised the trumpet to his lips. "Mrs. Harlow," his voice carried clearly across the clearing, "this confrontation is unnecessary. I've come to offer you a generous settlement for your property, $50,000, far above market value." Victoria moved to a position where she could respond without exposing herself. "My property isn't for sale." "Mr. Thornton," she called back, her voice steady, despite the emotion coursing through her. "Neither is justice for my husband's murder." A momentary silence followed her words before Thornton spoke again. "I had nothing to do with your husband's unfortunate accident. However, I'm willing to contribute to a memorial fund in his name as part of our agreement." "I have the letter, Thornton," Victoria responded, "the one you sent to your agent ordering Thomas's permanent silence, your handwriting, your personal seal, along with documented evidence of every land fraud you've orchestrated across the territory." Through her sight, Victoria watched Thornton's composed facade crack slightly, his hand tightening around the speaking trumpet. "Whatever documents you think you have are forgeries," he countered, though uncertainty had entered his tone. "But I'm a reasonable man. Let's discuss terms that could benefit us both." "The only terms I'm interested in discussing," Victoria replied coldly, "are those you'll hear from Judge Carlton when you're brought before his court." Thornton's expression darkened. "You're making a grave error, Mrs. Harlow. No one refuses Maxwell Thornton and prospers." "You killed the wrong man's wife," Victoria stated with deadly certainty, "and I've spent 3 years ensuring you'll answer for it." She nodded to Davies, who adjusted his aim and fired a precisely calculated shot that struck the ground directly between Thornton's feet. The railroad magnate stumbled backward in shock as his guards drew their weapons, scanning frantically for the source of the shot. "That was courtesy of the Phantom Division. Mr. Thornton," Victoria called out, "the next one won't miss. Your team is already neutralized, your operation compromised, and evidence of your crimes en route to Judge Carlton in Denver. The territorial governor will receive copies by morning." Thornton's face contorted with rage as he realized the extent of his defeat. "Who are you?" he demanded. "The widow you underestimated," Victoria answered simply. "The wife of the man you murdered. The justice you can't escape." With a gesture to his remaining men, Thornton retreated to the tree line, his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him. Through her observation network, Victoria tracked their hasty departure. Not a tactical withdrawal, but a full retreat. "He'll run for the border," Sullivan predicted, watching Thornton's disappearing figure. "He keeps emergency funds and documentation in Wyoming territory. He won't make it," Hawkins stated confidently. "I dispatched telegrams to all neighboring jurisdictions before coming here. Every sheriff and marshal within 200 miles will be watching for him." As the forest fell silent once more, Victoria finally stepped away from her firing position. 3 years of single-minded purpose, gathering evidence, preparing defenses, waiting for the perfect moment, had culminated in this day of reckoning. 2 weeks later, Victoria stood in Judge Carlton's Denver courtroom as the verdict was read. Maxwell Thornton, railroad magnate and land speculator, found guilty on all counts: fraud, corruption, and the murder of federal land agent Thomas Harlow. The evidence she had meticulously compiled, combined with testimony from Sullivan and his men, had created an irrefutable case. As Thornton was led away in chains, Judge Carlton approached Victoria. "An extraordinary achievement, Mrs. Harlow. Your husband would be proud." "Thomas believed in justice through evidence and law, not just guns," Victoria replied quietly. "I tried to honor that belief. The territorial governor was impressed by your methodical approach." Carlton continued, "He's establishing a new investigative division within the marshal's office and needs someone with your unique skills to lead it." Victoria considered the offer thoughtfully. For 3 years, vengeance had been her sole purpose. Now, with that chapter closed, a new possibility presented itself. Using her abilities to bring systematic justice to the frontier, the division would need proper resources. She noted trained investigators, laboratory equipment, documentation systems. Carlton smiled, recognizing her implicit acceptance. "The governor anticipated your requirements. He's already approved the budget." 1 month later, Victoria Harlow stood in her cabin for the final time. The fortress that had served her so well was being transformed. Not abandoned, but repurposed. The defensive modifications would remain, but the space would now serve as a training facility for the territory's first generation of scientific investigators. As she packed the last of Thomas's photographs, a knock sounded at the door. Sheriff Hawkins stood on her porch, hat in hand. "The first recruits arrive tomorrow." He reported 6 men and 2 women selected from across the territory. "All with aptitudes similar to what you specified," Victoria nodded her approval. "Good, we'll start with evidence, preservation techniques, and scene documentation." Hawkins hesitated briefly. "They're nervous about training under the legendary Shadow." A small smile touched Victoria's lips. "They shouldn't be. Shadow was a weapon of war. Chief Investigator Harlow is a builder of justice." As she closed the cabin door behind her, Victoria gazed across the property that had been both her refuge and her battleground. The widow's cabin would now serve a greater purpose, much like the widow herself. The frontier was changing, and Victoria Harlow would help shape that change, transforming frontier justice from fast guns to methodical investigation, one case at a time. The sun sets over the transformed cabin, its silhouette no longer a fortress against enemies, but a beacon for something new. Inside, students of investigation replaced the solitary widow who once stood guard. 3 years of preparation culminated in a single day of reckoning, a husband's murder avenged not with blind rage, but with meticulous justice, evidence over vengeance, law over gunfire. The price was steep years of solitude, a life suspended in grief's amber, waiting for the moment when preparation would meet opportunity. In the end, what began as one woman's quest for retribution evolved into something far greater. The widow's cabin, built for war, now serves the peace. The hands that once steadied a rifle now guide others to collect the quiet evidence that speaks louder than gunshots across the frontier. Perhaps this is how the West truly changes, not through the celebrated gunfighters whose legends fill dime novels, but through those who understand that true power lies in patience, in documentation, in the slow, inexorable machinery of justice properly applied. As the territory grows into something resembling civilization, one wonders how many other silent guardians move among us, men and women forever changed by war and loss, who choose to rebuild rather than destroy, whose greatest victories will never be recorded in history's pages. Sometimes the most profound change comes not from those who seek glory, but from those who simply refuse to let darkness prevail.